All right, folks. We're getting close to starting. I'll wait for Katie to give me the cue, but I see you all rolling in. Okay, we'll get started. Welcome. My name is Gary Clark, and I get the distinct pleasure and opportunity to welcome you all to the economic forecast presented by Banner Bank. It's Thursday, and we have an exciting roster of speakers to bring to you. Again, I'm Gary Clark, Economic Alliance, Snohomish County's new president and CEO. And just a quick intro about myself. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I come to you by way of Omaha, Nebraska, and I've been in the economic development realm for a little over 12 to 13 years. And I am extremely excited to join you all in the Pacific Northwest. So thank you for the warm welcomes. And I just have a little bit of housekeeping to do before we get started officially. So please ask questions in the Q&A section as we dive in, and Chris Meffert will actually be monitoring those questions and making sure that you get those answers from the presenters. Additionally, the presentations will be shared via email, so you don't have to worry about trying to track the information. You can sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. We'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for this event. Our presenting sponsor, Banner Bank. Our partnering sponsor, the Boeing Company. Our signature sponsors, Alaska Airlines, Classic Country KXA, the Everett Clinic, KRKO Greatest Hits, Kaiser Permanente, Linwood Convention Center, Snohomish County PUD, and our event sponsors. All right, folks, here's our first welcome. I'd like to introduce to you all our first speaker, Jeff Mitchell, Senior Vice President and Manager of Banner Bank's Commercial Lending Group in Snohomish County and the North Sound region. This is the 8th year in a row that Banner Bank has been the presenting sponsor of this event, and they have also been a longtime partner with EASC for many, many years. Banner Bank works with clients in a number of diverse sectors and industries, including manufacturing, service delivery, wholesaling, international trade. In addition, Banner is one of the most recognized banks in the Northwest. They were again named, listen to this, one of the 100 best banks in America by Forbes for the 5th year in a row, and Forbes also named Banner to their best banks in the world list in 2020. So I've set the stage for you, Jeff. Go ahead and knock it out of the park, buddy.
All right, Gary, thank you. And it's great to be here and be the presenting sponsor again. And the first shout out, first welcome goes to Gary. Welcome to this event. I know you've only been here a couple of weeks. You've landed in a great spot in the country, a great county, and with a great organization. So welcome, and look forward to working with you. Boy, it just seems like yesterday. It was a year ago. We were gathered at the Linwood Convention Center. The room was packed, and several people started to talk about, the speakers were mentioning this new virus coming out, COVID-19. And at the time, it was, well, obviously the full effects weren't known, but there was a lot of conjecture and such, and said, well, the forecast might be this if that doesn't happen. Well, we know here we are a year later, and all of us, I'm sure, have many stories to tell about what's gone in our personal lives and business lives over the last year. It's been really quite a ride, but thank you for joining us today. We have a great group. We set another record. But First of all, I also want to thank too it's been said time and time again, but the first responders, our healthcare workers, and those workers that are keeping the supply chains open. It's been a monumental task. They're taking a risk to serve us, and just we really appreciate all that they've done to keep the economy going. And of course, the EASC team did a great job of pulling together another spectacular group of speakers. I think you're going to hear a lot of new information, very interesting, and thank you very much for the team at EASC for putting that together. I also want to welcome our clients. Thank you for being here today. Appreciate your support and our partnership. And on behalf of our 2,200 colleagues here at Banner Bank, yeah, this is our 8th year of sponsoring this event. We are just so delighted to be a part of it. And it just proves that this area keeps growing. And even pandemic or not, we are, Snohomish County is just a key to Washington State. And we just look forward to being a part of that for many years to come. Banner Bank is 131 years old. We actually started as a small business in 1890, made it through several recessions, depressions, et cetera, and still here standing tall. We're focused on 4 states, Washington, Oregon, California, and Idaho. And we really understand our part in local economies. Our core value is really summed up in just one phrase, and it's do the right thing. And we do that by delivering on our promise to be connected, knowledgeable, and responsive. And 2020 was took on special meaning. We produced over 9,000 PPP loans, totaling over 1.1 billion to local businesses throughout our footprint. And happy to report that 80% of those loans were $150,000 or less. So they went to the small businesses that really needed it the most. That effort continues on in 2021, the second round of PPP loans. And I know we are in the low thousands as far as the number of applications that we're processing for that. So really important for us to be a part of that. And also we've helped out food banks, the Salvation Army, and we announced a new initiative last year, and it's the Small Business Opportunity Fund. And we funded that with $1.5 million of seed money. The fund is used to assist minority-owned small businesses with a focus on underserved small businesses owned by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as businesses in economically disadvantaged rural and urban communities. If you want to find out more about this fund, you can reach out to our website or give me a call after. And now it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, and that's Chris Mefford. And Chris has done a fantastic job with guiding EASC in an interim role. And Chris has been interim CEO since September. He's participated in many EASC events and collaborated with the Snohomish County Executive Recovery Task Force to support community and industrial recovery projects. Chris is the founder and CEO of Community Attributes, Inc., a regional economics and planning consulting firm in Seattle. CAI has supported EASC and Workforce Snohomish with regional, economic, and workforce analysis. He will draw on this ongoing work to frame the path ahead toward recovery and economic opportunity. Chris, now over to you.
Jeff, thank you. I appreciate that introduction. Thank you. Thank you to Katie and the team for pulling this great event together. And Jeff, I know that your sponsorship from Banner Bank is greatly appreciated year in and year out with this. So I'm going to warm things up a little bit with sort of a global to local outlook of economic information. Very excited about the panelists that will follow me. So I will be efficient and get out of the way and keep them whole on their minutes that they were promised. Glad to see WSU investing in business and economic work in Snohomish County. They will be a fantastic partner in years to come. And very pleased to have Skylar Olson join us this morning as well. Skylar had been chief economist at Zillow, and Skylar and I have shared the stage many a time together, and have a woman economist share this stage with us is just a great perspective as well. So it's sort of the icing on the cake there. So looking forward to hearing their remarks, and I will breeze through the context here. For those of you that don't know me, I run a company called Community Attributes in downtown Seattle. We're about 15 people big. We focus on economics and urban planning, and it has been my great privilege and pleasure to help Economic Alliance out the past few months with interim CEO services. And one of the greatest accomplishments we've had was to bring on your own new CEO, Gary Clark, who warmed us up in introduction. So I'm glad to have been a part of all that. I put this slide together last spring. I started working early on the economic impacts as we knew the severity of the virus, in the same way that Jeff described it. About a year ago, we were all seeing something come around the corner. We didn't know what it was. I gave a talk to One Redmond at about this time, and we were hosted in Microsoft's office. I got a feeling the folks at Microsoft had a little better information than I did about the virus at that time, because as I was hemming and hawing about worst case scenarios of being a year or two of an impact with this, I could see the folks in the room sort of a little more in the know, kind of nodding more sagely than I was. So that portended a very difficult period that we're now in the midst of still. This picture I've drawn on the screen here is a model. It's not directly tied to data, but it's meant to convey our understanding of where I think we are. We are in a wonderful spot now. The fact that we have a vaccine, we don't have it distributed at scale, and that's the key, right? The economy can only recover with public health confidence. University of Michigan for years has done this thing called the Consumer Confidence Index, which has been critical to drive our economies our understanding of the consumer economy, which makes up about 70% of all transactions nationwide in the US. And now we have the need for this thing called the Public Health Confidence Index as well, the Health Confidence Index. And that's conceptual in my mind as I tell this story with the picture on your screen there. But we are in a great spot where we're seeing those positive cases start to plummet and go down at a very steep rate. Fingers crossed it'll continue to do so, and we can begin our economic recovery at scale once everyone feels safe to come back and return to some of those activities that we've known and loved up until the pandemic. But it's going to be a long slog, and that's the theme to my talk here this morning, is to set the stage a little bit and to understand what we're in it for. We're at the beginning of a long, slow recovery, and this historic data tell that rather grimly. It's going to be a long grind to get back to that level of activity that we were at prior to the pandemic. The U.S. gross domestic product was forecasted, is projected to have been a decline of about 5.6% in 2020. It was very volatile last year, as you all know. In Q2, it tanked, and if you were to annualize that data, which wasn't terribly useful given the volatility at the time, it would have looked like the sky is falling at a rate of 39% gross domestic product annualized. In periods of volatility, those annualized numbers aren't that useful. And to understand what really happened on a quarterly basis, we've translated that into the blue bars on the right of your screen. But on net, we ended down 5.6%. And for a metric that economists trade on and hang to on the tenths of the percentage, to be clear, that's a pretty catastrophic number going into the pandemic that we would not have thought ever possible prior to that. It goes way back to the recession and those, to the depression, excuse me, since we've had declines of gross domestic product at that level. Some interesting things happened along the way, though. As the federal government poured money into the economy, more than $2.2 trillion with the CARES Act in 2020, and we get ready to see another $1.9 trillion potentially into the economy. Some interesting things come with that. All those PPP loans, and those EIDL loans, and the business loans that are so important are really that stopgap measure in between that let businesses pay their landlords and their suppliers and do their best to keep their employees from entering the unemployment system. It's just one of many means of cash infusions that the government spending was so important to have done to keep it together. And a lot of talk right now is important to get that one more push from the federal government out. The lessons learned by many in 2008 recession was that we backed off of those recovery packages a little too early. And as a result, the recovery went longer than it would have out of the Great Recession. So a lot of economists in the Federal Reserve are hoping that we can get more government support right now to get us over that hump, to get us back to that full, so those full productivity measures sooner than we would without those stimulus packages. Personal savings is a very interesting topic, though. Right now, you can see that incomes overall actually went up in 2020 because of these measures, because of the support from the federal government. Wages and compensation actually went down a little bit on their own, but transfer receipts in the form of unemployment and all the other Social Security, all those normal transfer receipts added on in there were actually quite high. And as a result, personal savings rate was higher than I ever thought I would have seen in my lifetime. I've been tracking this data as part of my economic talks for many years. And in the 2000s, when we saw personal savings going down, and in fact, it even hit in the negative territory conceptually for a short period before the Bureau of Economic Analysis corrected it and got it back just a little bit in the positive territory. We never would have expected to see personal savings rates above 10% based on the trends that had been happening with that. But last April, it spiked almost 40%. Well, more than 1/3 anyway, as shown on your chart there. And as personal savings has gone down and come closer to the way spending was before the pandemic, it is still at a high rate. As a result, there is money, there is savings in many Americans' savings account, the money they have not been spending on vacations and hospitality and all the consumer-facing experiences has ended up in their savings account. This is where the story of the haves and have-nots really kicks in. If you had income, you were spending less and saving more in 2020. And if you didn't have income, you're frustrated because that means you are in an industry that was depending on consumers to spend that money. Without that money flowing through the economy, all of our workers, our restaurant workers, our hotels, the air travel industry, everyone that depended on that consumer spending was left out and did not have the income. Closer to home, this is how that transpired in 2020 for Snohomish County. And this curve, I assure you, follows Washington State very closely. A little bit different nationwide, but only a little bit different. You can see the spike in unemployment claims to have hit in the height of the pandemic last April. And then things dropped off, and the new unemployment claims, as we were tracking on a week-to-week basis in 2020, started to level off and taper off. There was a little bit of an uptick in January as a result of some of the seasonal unemployment that comes with after the holidays. However, we're hopeful it'll stay low and not start to climb again. Historically, to put it in context, and this is where some of the challenges with the unemployment rate data as a metric start to become evident. You can see that unemployment in Snohomish County is about 5% right now. Actually, it's up to 7.8% in December, excuse me, 6.7% for the nation as a whole. There's some really good data and stories in the past week or so that we know that this underestimates the amount of suffering and unemployment that is actually in the economy, or underemployment, if you will. You can be counted as having a job and not in the workforce if you're not looking for a job. And so the number of women and folks that are running their families that dropped out of the workforce because of those challenges of keeping the child care going at home, and they've opted out of the workforce, so they're not counted as part of that unemployment rate. So as a result, we know that the unemployment rate actually underestimates the number of people that are not as employed as they wish they were. Cumulatively, this slide is really meant to highlight those consumer-facing industries that I spoke to a minute ago, between the food services and the retail trade and the arts and entertainment, shown a little darker orange there. In Snohomish County, we are distinctive in the manufacturing jobs that have the higher unemployment claims because of the challenges of Boeing and the aerospace industry, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. Other than that, the types of industries that have been hurting in Snohomish County really mirror the nation as a whole. And we'll talk a little bit more about aerospace and Boeing, of course, as we walk through the Snohomish County economy. This slide shows how this nets out on jobs losses in the orange on the left. And this is how you can start to see some of the challenges with the unemployment versus the actual headcount and jobs losses. We can have lots of unemployment claims while having relatively fewer job losses tied to that, because you can claim unemployment and get partial unemployment even though you might be counted as having a job if you're only working a part-time job along the way. But this is where it starts to shake out to understand industry by industry how far we've fallen. When you roll it all up across the economy, this starts to show our long climb back. We hit We started to lose jobs in March last year, just a little bit when the pandemic really hit in the middle of March, and the monthly employment measures covered a little bit pre-pandemic, a little bit post-pandemic. We hit our low point in April and are starting a long, slow climb on a month-to-month basis. We really started to flatten out in late summer, and it's going to be a little bit up and down as we continue to restore a little more slowly towards that full employment level. And I'll give a little bit more context on historically how that's been the case. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here and skip a couple of slides. Aerospace is still our #1 sector in Snohomish County. And as we work through the challenges with Boeing and be supportive of maintaining that workforce and find jobs in Snohomish County for the aerospace workforce, we want to be ready for whenever conversations about a new airplane come back around. But in the meantime, aerospace still ranks high as a major employer, not just with Boeing, but with the supply chain companies up and down the county. This slide here, and if I'm going too quickly and you can't pick it on the screen, don't worry, we'll send these slides out to everyone on the call afterwards so you can get a little closer look at them. This is an unusual mix in Snohomish County compared to the nation as a whole. It shows this mix of aerospace workers and the retail facing, the consumer facing occupations, occupation by occupation, to show how those have changed. In most economies across the country, it's heavily tilted towards that consumer services industry. But in our case, as we work through the aerospace challenges, we've got a mix of those jobs as well. Boeing backlog for 737 is still important, with over 3,200 jobs or airplanes on backlog to be built and delivered. That's important to Snohomish County because of the aerospace supply chain for the 737 that exists in Snohomish County. As a whole, for Washington State, it's still above and away the highest concentration of workers at the Boeing company, as shown on the chart on the left. This is off Boeing's website very recently and updated. The commercial airplanes sector, which is headquartered here in the Seattle area, has almost 35,000 jobs still in it. And that's just Boeing alone. The rest of the aerospace sector, with all the supply chain, adds to that, of course. So we know it's been a challenge. The news of the 787 was disappointing, of course. Most of that job loss had already experienced in Snohomish County as a result of COVID and a result of the pandemic and the drop in air travel. We know, and we're grateful for conversations we've had with Boeing Company over the past few months, that they're committed to their presence in Snohomish County. So we're just going to work together in workforce to retain that skilled workforce in Snohomish County to be ready for when jobs do come back in time. And this is what it looks like a little bit, what that might be like, is putting this current recession in context of the past recessions. What was unusual about this pandemic recession was the severity of the decline at the outset. In the past, our recessions have started more gradual and hit their low point more slowly. Here, we plummeted last March and April, like I said, and we had a rebound really quickly in May and June as things started to reopen a little bit. But now that we've gotten past that, where that dark red line is solid, now we can expect a slower recovery that's on par with other recoveries. It takes a long time to reopen things. A lot of this recession has been compared to the recovery from Katrina in the New Orleans area, which I think is a really good comparison. I had just out of coincidence, I happened to be traveling in New Orleans about a year after Katrina, and there were businesses just opening for the very first time 1 full year after that. And even though the floodwaters had gone away, it takes a long time to reopen the machinery, get your workforce back in place, get all the systems in place to open a business. So for those medium to larger size businesses to reopen and restart is a long gradual process. Just a couple more slides before I hand it off to our next speakers here. At Economic Alliance, we were fortunate to be able to retain Adam Prager and his company for some competitive analysis in Snohomish County to build on work that his team had done with community attributes, in fact, at Greater Seattle Partners a couple of years back. And we asked Adam to take a close look at the Snohomish County economy as is at the end of 2020 and to help us set the strategies for what sectors we can anticipate growing. He took a good look at the workforce, look at our comparative advantages. You know, this region is still going to be very competitive in years to come. The things that we're struggling with outside of Boeing's challenges specifically are the same things the rest of the country is struggling with. And people will want to come here where so much innovation and job growth has come out of this economy, historically will be part of that recovery. And as a result, you can see an emphasis on information technology. A lot of those manufacturing and processing jobs take advantage of our innovation sectors and our technological strengths in this region. And those strengths will carry us out of the recession in due time. And there's a lot of bright spots happening. It's been fun to be a part of the Economic Alliance the past few months and to hear some of the interests of new companies coming into the region. And the conversation is swirling around for companies' interests in Snohomish County. Just a few thoughts to wrap things up. The recovery will take, restarting the economy will be slower than we wish it were. We look at key indicators like air travel, hotel occupancy, convention attendance. That's when we're going to get over the hump to say, okay, things are back to that normality that we're seeking for public health confidence to drive full economic activity. I don't buy all of the hype that things are going to be different. There will be some things different. Cities can take advantage of that, especially cities outside of the downtown core who want to build on those satellite offices and to continue some of the behaviors that have changed with people starting to work from home. It's going to be up to the cities to really invest in those processes to create those space and the capacity for those commercial spaces to encourage companies to stay in new places outside of some of the areas where they've been invested in years past. But it really comes down to a few simple things to reopen this economy. And we got to make it safe to be at work and play. We got to make it safe to get to work and play. And you got to make it safe for your family when you're at work and play. Or at work, sorry, you should be playing with your family. So make it safe when you're at work, right? So if we get all those pieces put together, then with or without the vaccine and how it all comes together, we've accomplished these things. Many businesses have been resilient to be able to show how they've been able to adapt it. But of course, with that, it's all about the vaccine right now to get it up to scale, to reduce that risk, to make it even easier to achieve those public health goals. I like to wrap up with this slide. It's a graphic I've put together over the years that speaks to our practice at community attributes. Economic Alliance is really focused right in the middle there, in the upper two tiers of the pyramid in particular. But cities and communities play a big part in economic development. You got to be a good place to live first and foremost. Snohomish County has that in spades. That's your competitive advantage that you can leverage. Work with what we've got, retain that workforce we have, find new opportunities for them, and then go out and get the word out about what a great place it is to attract business to Snohomish County. With that, I'll say thank you. Thanks for your time. I'm going to hand it back over to Gary to facilitate us forward. And I'm going to play a little bit of an additional role here this morning. I'm going to hop on the chat window while the others are talking. And if I can field some of your questions and take notes for future follow-up, I'll be happy to do so. Gary, back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Chris, for that amazing presentation. It gave us a lot of insight, so really appreciate that. I now have the opportunity to introduce and welcome EASC board member, Dr. Paul Petrie, Chancellor of Washington State University, Everett. And Paul, I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done and pass it on to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Gary. And on behalf of Washington State University, I want to welcome our new president and CEO, Mr. Gary Clark, to Washington and to the North Puget Sound. Under usual circumstances, I would do this in person, but I think we've all learned to improvise a bit and gotten pretty good at that. But Gary, we have several gifts for you, and I'll just show you this. This is the famous Coug swag bag, so we've got that for you, and I hope you'll enjoy these gifts. But the main thing I want to say is that we are so happy to have you here in the Northwest, and we're glad that you chose to come here. And Washington State University is really anxious and happy to work with you as we begin to further economic development in Snohomish County and the region. So welcome. All right. WSU has a rich history in the Snohomish County community. We have an array of industry-aligned degree programs like business, engineering, and data analytics. And all of these degree programs are designed to boost the economy and to ensure our residents will have access to robust employment opportunities for generations to come. Economic development is in our mission, it's in our purpose, and it's in our DNA. And I also want to be sure to mention that we have a new bachelor's degree in business administration, and that is available to community members and students right now. It's a part of that mission that I spoke of, that mission to strengthen local economies and to increase opportunities for our graduates. So that's something that we are committed to. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. So today we have Dr. Larry W. Chip Hunter, and he was appointed Dean of Washington State University's CARSON College of Business in 2015. He leads the college in its mission to create insight and opportunity through the study of business and the power of our community for Washington State and the world. Dr. Hunter is committed to building educational opportunities that create upward mobility for our students and to strengthen the Pacific Northwest economy. He's passionate about the role of research universities play in student development, from bringing high achieving faculty and cutting edge research to the classroom, to opportunities for undergraduates to interact with graduate students and gain exposure to research methods. Prior to coming to Washington State University, Dr. Hunter was the Senior Associate Dean of the School of Business at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He served on the Wisconsin faculty for 13 years, winning multiple teaching awards, and was named the Pyle Bascom Professor in Leadership. Before joining the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2002, he spent 8 years on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Hunter earned his bachelor's degree at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where he was a Harry S. Truman Scholar. At Penn, he was awarded the Thuron Scholarship to study in the United Kingdom, and he holds a master's degree in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford University. Dr. Hunter earned his doctoral degree in industrial relations and human resource management from the Sloan School of Management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He was raised in the Palouse, graduating from high school in Moscow, Idaho, where he was a U.S. presidential scholar. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chip Hunter, who is the Dean of the CARSON College of Business at Washington State University. Dean Hunter.
Thanks, Paul, for that overly generous introduction, and good morning to everyone. Paul's a close colleague, and we're working hard together on these new programs, and I will talk with you a little bit about that in a few minutes. Really appreciate the invitation to speak with you today. Again, I'm Chip. I'm the Dean of the Washington State University CARSON College. Wanted to start by noting that Chris Mefford is a tough act to follow. It's great data and real great insight. I really share, Chris, that framing of let's get our public health problems and challenges addressed, and that's a big ingredient in getting business back on its feet. So it really is a privilege to share the virtual stage with Chris. I also want to thank Jeff and Banner Bank for sponsoring, Gary for leadership of this group, and of course, Katie for keeping us organized. Today, I want to start by sharing some insights with you from our CARSON College's 4th annual Business in the Northwest report before turning to a little bit about what we're going to be doing to extend opportunities here in Northwest Washington. Start by noting that partnerships between the business community and higher ed are really important to our region's economy. The CARSON College is committing to helping businesses develop the future talent pool, the region, local areas, the state. And as part of the great research enterprise that is Washington State University, which is our state's land-grant university, I'm committed to working with you to increase our shared understanding of what's happening in the business world around us. And that's partly why I'm with you today. So we wanted to talk about our Business in the Northwest report. This is our 4th annual Business in the Northwest survey, where we want to hear directly from Pacific Northwest business leaders and employees to get a better sense of the state of the business climate and how the region's business community is faring. we look at folks in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So our fourth annual report is based on a survey of over 1,000 Pacific Northwest business leaders, employees, and in this fourth report, a special focus on Gen Z employees. We've got some insights to share about those folks with you as we move through this. Here, we're going to provide a deeper look at how the perceived trajectory of business in the Pacific Northwest has been altered by the pandemic. And so I'll jump right to it. Let's turn to the key findings from this year's report. High-level overview here. Don't have to tell this group that businesses are the heartbeat of our Pacific Northwest communities. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really laid challenges on them that they have never faced before. Chris did a great job of outlining what's going on out there. Here in the CARSON College, when the first stay-at-home orders were enacted in March of 2020, like many of you, we were unsure of the impact on the business community. We had done our Business in the Northwest survey a couple of times before and found tremendous optimism in the Pacific Northwest about where business was going, what the future held. A year later, this pandemic, as Chris mentioned, has forced some businesses to shutter permanently, some temporarily, others remain very uncertain what the future holds. Yet amid these closures, this uncertainty, and an incredible year of anxiety and real trepidation about where we're going, our report actually still finds business leaders and employees across the Northwest remaining cautiously optimistic. So let's jump into these key findings, and I'll note that you can do this too. We're going to put a link in the chat, and you can take a look at our data, sort it. Because we focus on the entire region of the Pacific Northwest, I want to note that it's not quite possible to cut it down to Snohomish County, that specifically, but you get a sense, I think, in the broader region of what's going on. Now, what do we know? Not surprisingly, across the Pacific Northwest, COVID-19 has had a negative effect on the economy. 3 in 4 business leaders and employees say COVID-19 has had a negative effect on their company. This is among the folks we surveyed. And among the leaders, this is a 10 percentage point jump since last June, when we were a few months into the pandemic. Now, what's underneath this, the concerns here? Well, the continued effects of the virus itself and the lack of a widely available vaccine were the 2 top reported barriers to success among business leaders. But we also have other issues, global uncertainty, which catches the pandemic, as well as a number of other issues. And political or social polarization was named by over a quarter of the respondents as leading concern with respect to continued success in the business climate. And we can now turn to what this actually means for our business leaders. Prior to COVID-19, our reporting, these surveys showed that the business outlook was great, and over half of our business leaders and employees felt the Pacific Northwest business climate had been strengthening over recent years. This year's report, though, showed a flattened trajectory for the region's climate. Accounting for COVID-19, this year's report finds only about a third of business leaders and only 17% of employees identifying the business climate as on a positive trajectory. So not to make light of the situation at all, but remember, we talked about attempting to flatten the COVID curve. Here, we've seen a lot of perceived flattening of the business curve. We saw folks in the Pacific Northwest in our first couple of surveys pre-COVID seeing us on a very positive trajectory. Now the perception is less positive, with a third of the folks perceiving it negatively. These are the leaders. Third perceiving it still positively, and another third saying, yeah, it looks pretty flat. So now let's take a closer look at what we're seeing with COVID-19 and Washington State. We've got businesses across the region putting measures in place to support their employees during the pandemic. The top measures named by business employers include changed work schedules. This was something that was adopted fairly early in the pandemic, flexible work hours and those kinds of things. About 3/4 of our employers were doing this in June 2020, and they're still reporting that these are necessary adjustments to the pandemic. Interestingly, though, as we've lived through more of this, we're seeing increased adaptation. We've got 61% of our respondents reporting that they've instituted new work protocols. That's a 9-point gain from last June. Communication is up heavily. 61%, just like the protocols, reporting that they have increased company-wide communication relative to before the pandemic. And this is a 14-point increase from what we observed last June. We've also got investments in new work equipment. That's up from June. And I think this is quite important. About half the businesses reporting that they have implemented mental health resources for their employees. So across the Northwest, we're seeing adaptation and changed business operations to better operate amid this unique pandemic climate, something that we've not lived through in almost all of our lifetimes. Now, some of these changes, where appropriate, have actually paid off. And we asked, among the applicable things that you could change, what have been most helpful to your business? And we do see a big shift to online efforts. So where it's applicable, about 9 in 10 say that they've increased online retail efforts and implemented new kinds of delivery. We're also seeing the introduction of new products and services by a very large majority of those who are responding to us. We also know that government regulation has played a large role in how businesses have responded to the pandemic. And we were interested to know how business leaders felt about their state government and federal government's response to this situation. And it does help that business leaders report high confidence in their local and state government's pandemic response. About 3/4 of our respondents report positive feelings about the response at this level, and this is up since June 2020. We looked more closely at the 3 states in our sample, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and we see in each of these states that the majority of business leaders feel positively about their state government's response to COVID-19. And here in Pullman, where I'm watching out my window, the snow continue to fall on the Palouse, we share a border with Idaho, and it is very easy to observe the differences in state government's response to COVID-19. But again, we see that in each of these states, there's a majority favorable response to what the state government is doing. Interestingly, most favorable in the state of Washington among the 3 states. We did this survey in December, and we saw less favorable takes on the federal government response in December. When we do the survey again, I don't know if we'll still be in pandemic, but it will be interesting, I think, to get a take on whether these things start to converge as we see, I think, an increasing effort to coordinate the response at the federal level. Again, though, I think in each of the states, people are essentially agreeing with what Chris said, which is that the state government response, which is to get a handle on the pandemic and the public health challenge as a way of restoring business, is the preferred response by most of our business leaders in the region. Now, we also this year wanted to see how Gen Z was faring amid the pandemic. These are our youngest employees in the workforce, age 18 to 23, and how they're dealing with the impact of COVID-19. We truly didn't have an underlying hypothesis on this. We were just interested in surfacing some data, seeing where we were, what we might learn from it, and perhaps getting some ideas for continued study. But very interestingly, at least to me, navigating remote work with little experience to fall back on has proved challenging for these Gen Z employees, our youngest workers, with almost half reporting that working from home has a negative impact on their mental well-being. And what I think is particularly interesting, given that I think our typical picture of a young employee, our Gen Z workers, would be that they are very facile with technology. They can really navigate different kinds of apps. They're comfortable interacting remotely. You know, they're on their phone all the time, if we can talk stereotypically. They're actually more likely than other employees to be affected by key pain points, like at-home distractions, decreased ability to focus, disrupted work-life balance, Now, it's not clear that these problems are unique to Gen Z as opposed to young people who typically are living in more crowded situations, sharing places with roommates, perhaps their families, and maybe finding difficult to focus and have certain expectations about what their work-life balance is. But it is interesting to note, I think, that the facility with technology has not made the work during the pandemic experience particularly pleasant for Gen Z. They are suffering not just like everybody else, but from their perspective, more than others when we ask them to report the impact of these kinds of challenges during the pandemic. So I'll leave it to you at this point, and you can play with our data, as I mentioned, on our website to decide, along with the kind of overall sweep that Chris showed you, how dire the situation is. But I will note, and this is a continuing theme in our work, that optimism remains in the Pacific Northwest. We're finding that everybody's ready to get back to the office. Well, everybody's a little strong, but 2/3 of our business leaders, our employees, and our Gen Z employees are ready to return to the office at least part-time. And we did this in December before the vaccine rollout. I think maybe some folks were really looking forward to it. I suspect those numbers will be higher today, but in December, we've got 2/3 of the folks saying we're ready to get back to the office. And over the 4 years we've been tracking the business climate, we have tracked an enduring sense of optimism throughout the Northwest over the years. And this year, we're still seeing that the percentage of business leaders who agree that the business climate is changing in a good way is favorable. And actually, it's bounced up from what we found in 2020, where we were at 68% to 75% reporting optimism in this year's report. The start of the new year brings new changes. We've got the rollout of the vaccine. We've got a new federal government administration. And it seems that we're picking up a light at the end of the tunnel from our business leaders in the Northwest. And despite these unprecedented challenges, most business leaders over 9 and 10, and most of the employees as well, feel their company is prepared to withstand changes and challenges in the next 3 years. Now, our youngest members of the region's workforce experiencing these particular challenges are going to be our business leaders of the future. And this is particularly important to us at the Carson College. It's probably one of the key reasons why we wanted to know what was up with these folks. So I want to turn and talk a little bit about what we do in the Carson College in my remaining few minutes. We are really aiming to prepare students for successful business careers. Useful to note that we produce the most business grads in the Pacific Northwest at Washington State University, more than 1,000 this past year, in programs at 4 WSU campuses across the state and in our nationally ranked number 3 in the country online business program for undergraduates. These independent rankings reflect the exceptional quality of our academic programs. Our online programs are also particularly strong, ranked as best online program for veterans and in the top 20 overall online MBA programs in US News and World Report, as well as the new trendy ranking Poets and Quants. And we're continuing to innovate to help prepare students to become employees and then leaders who can learn, grow, and advance across a range of settings. It was over 3 years ago that I charged a task force with revising our undergraduate program at Washington State University. And what we came up with is we're Cougs at Washington State, and in our business college, we are Carson Cougs. So we came up with a program that we've dubbed the Next Carson Coug. And we implemented curriculum changes at the undergraduate level, introducing students earlier to the business world by adding new courses for freshmen and sophomores, aiming to create career relevance and help students get ready for internships that companies like yours offer to these underclass students. We've also moved to smaller classes to allow faculty to get to know students better, enable discussions, and move away from standard lecture formats. And because we believe that students learn less by gaining experience, we're now requiring students to build up experience outside the classroom, and they continue to take classes in non-business subjects to make sure their education is comprehensive. So we've got students graduating with the key skills they need. We've also got a great online MBA program, as I mentioned, nationally ranked, and that delivers the same caliber of coursework and the same great faculty characteristic of a research university that you would get if you were in an MBA program on campus. But now you're doing it as a working professional depending on where you work, your home, your office, maybe the coffee shop, or a military base. As I mentioned, we're ranked very highly for the way we serve our veterans. Now, I really want to make sure that I don't shirk in mentioning our newest business offering, which we're really excited about, and that's right here in Northwest Washington at WSU Everett. We have introduced, as Paul mentioned, the Business Administration Bachelor's Degree. This is the most enrolled business program across the Washington State University system, and it is now available to students who want or need to stay close to home in Everett and study at that new beautiful building housing the WSU programs on the Everett campus. WSU Everett is rolling out this program, officially opens this fall as an addition to our hospitality program, but we've worked out a way for a few students to get a jump on it even now. And we really look forward to bringing more students into Everett in the fall. Our programs at WSU Everett, the bachelor's degree right now, are designed primarily for transfer students. And this business administration degree will be the campus's 8th bachelor's degree program. We are super excited to bring this excellent business education that we offer to Northwest Washington and your community. So as I wrap here, I just want to express my hope that the data from this year's Business in the Northwest report can help you drive some meaningful conversations in your organizations and with other leaders and propel your local area, our region forward, our business community. As we turn the page on a new year with the vaccine rollout, Pacific Northwest businesses still feel that we have advantages with respect to skills and resources, and we'll come out of the pandemic stronger than ever. And I'd like, as I close, to encourage you to help me build collaboration between your business and our higher education institutions. Through these partnerships, we can work together to create a powerful, thriving workforce in the Pacific Northwest. And since I'm at my time limit or close to it, I will wrap and say that I can pick up your questions in the chat. Really appreciate you having me here today. And as I always say, just like Paul, go Cougs.
All right. Well, thank you, Dean Chip Hunter, for providing this valuable insight on businesses in our region. Our next speaker, folks, is Dr. Skylar Olson. She's a principal economist at Climate Check, a startup dedicated to bringing climate change risk information home to everyday consumers, and founder of the Reimagine Economics. She also holds a PhD in economics with a specialization in economic metrics and environmental resource economics from the University of Washington. Previously, senior principal economist and director of economic research at Zillow, Dr. Olson was a foundational member of the public-facing economic research program at Zillow, and that was actually tied to, directed from many of Zillow's data sharing initiatives over 8 years of service. Additionally, we have found that Skylar, your name actually means noble scholar in England, and also in Dutch it means scholar. So without further ado, Dr. Skylar Olson.
That's great. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I love that. When I looked it up, I thought I found a reference that said Skylar meant a shelterer, someone that sheltered others. So that's really interesting. But maybe that's kind of similar, right? Nurture and you know, educate others. I don't know. Seems right. I named my daughter Theory. It's phonetically sciencey, right? But it's actually a Norse name that means thunder warrior. So I really do appreciate having the powerful names. Let me share my screen because quite like Chris and Dr. Hunter, you know, I'm also all about data and would like to share it with you guys. So let me get it to present mode. How are we doing? Do you see that first title page there? I'm going to pop it right down to a data slide. Oh, let me minimize all your beautiful faces so I can see my full slide here. So I'm starting in a pretty similar place that Chris started. Which is the idea that no matter what conversation that we're going to have, and fair warning, I'm going to lead us a little bit to talking about climate change because it's a crisis that predates and will exist after the pandemic crisis. And we have a wonderful opportunity while we're in such flux, right, to make sure we're putting our feet down in the right way to rebuild leaner, rebuild greener, right, to really kind of get our the next few decades in place for health and resiliency. Okay, but even that conversation really should start here because we are in the midst of a current, public health crisis. And as Chris mentioned, a lot of the initiatives getting the economy back together or even getting, on the path for a healthier climate and a healthier planet is going to depend on how we, really navigating and finishing this crisis. Okay, so, here, I have the New York Times actually does a great job publishing data sources to their GitHub account. So here you can see total COVID deaths, right? This is the absolute pain and trauma of everything that we're going through. Well, not all the pain and trauma, because a lot of it is pain and trauma coming from how we're trying to avoid deaths, right? But this trade-off and this complicated, endeavor that we're in to get to the other side of this. The one on the right, I've divided it by the total population of the county. So I do want to point out that Snohomish County, up north, probably, definitely a higher COVID-19 incidence of death per 1,000 people. You can tell, though, in those graphs, at least in the Snohomish one, that slope is slowing down. Let's pop to cases. Oh, how come I can't move my slide forward? There we go. Too far. Here's cases, right, which predate daily deaths. So on the left, you have cases, and on the right, you have daily deaths. And look at how good we're doing in terms of those case numbers coming on down, right? Which means things are going to look better into the future. So we're still experiencing those high levels of daily deaths, especially in King County, where the population is much higher, remember. But those cases are coming down, which means those deaths will soon come down as well. I love the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation from the university, associated with the University of Washington. I look at their modeling all the time, and they do a great job updating it constantly. So new models, introducing different assumptions, right? So when the vaccine rollout, started happening, they incorporated it into their model. What you see in front of you here is their expected daily deaths for the whole state of Washington. They do it at the state level. So when Chris's graph, if you kind of remember, he had, this is where we are today. And then he had the COVID metrics. This is absolutely kind of that shape. So that's, a lot of where Chris's understanding, I'm sure, is coming from, maybe not IHME, but other similar models that are projecting these things forward. This is not a time for complacency. Certainly, if you've already figured out, how to adapt to the new, public health guidelines that we've been under for, a while now, because I do want to point out that red line, that there is space for, if we do go too lax as we enter into the spring months, that things could get a bit worse again and not be on this trajectory that we want, which is the purple and the green. So going down and down and down, and then getting this behind us, and getting back to some incredible economic and life activity we've been really missing out on. Now, this public health crisis, right? It's insane. It has totally changed and evolved the way that we work and the way that we play or, inside. And as Chris kind of talked about, that has massive economic implications. And for the next few slides, the real feel that I want to get across, right? The argument that I'm going to be building in some ways here for this is, when I look at these series and I go back, as long as they're reported. So here I've got, I pulled them down from FRED through their API. So I can get these updated kind of employment numbers, right, for Snohomish County over time. The history goes back to 1990, and I can see, the dot-com bubble there right before, 2000. I can see, the housing bubble and bust and global financial crisis, 2007 and 8. You see that employment start coming down. What we see here for this pandemic is so sharp, so abrupt, right? That discontinuity in that line is incredible. I look at that, and if I didn't know what was happening, I'd say, oh my gosh, an incredible thing is happening to Snohomish County. And obviously this is not unique for Snohomish County. Like these numbers are reflected and, pulling so many counties across the US, right? This is a shock. This is trauma. This is an abrupt change. Everyone's living differently, and I can see it in the data that reflects our economy, right? And as Chris mentioned, with the unemployment rate, that's under undercounting really the joblessness in many ways, right? Because of discouraged workers or those that completely take themselves out of their the workforce, the participation rate. I pulled the Washington participation rate numbers, and they're down, a full 2 percentage points, more than 2 percentage points, which is a lot. Now, when you see that up to, I know it's, because I wanted to show you this full history so that you can just see how incredible the current moment is compared to, all the other moments. When we used to talk about the global financial crisis is, incredible on its own, right? And we're dwarfing that one. So I know it's hard to see, but you can see the unemployment rate tick back up again. And a lot of that has to do with, us entering the winter months, and leisure and hospitality also, coming on back down. So this is employment in the Seattle metropolitan area for employment. I can't get the industry numbers for Snohomish in particular, but you can see that employment in leisure and hospitality as, the winter comes on and we have to pull back a bit more, come down. Now, looking at those shocking numbers, we can see immediately, the fact that we're going through something incredible in that data. And then the aftermath of it, or well, not aftermath of it, because we're still in it, right? There are some surprising dynamics going on. And, when Chris spoke to the divide, right? The great sort that we're kind of coming through, right? It's the job, those that maintain employment, and the jobless, those that are able to save more, or those that are experiencing an incredible loss of livelihood. This is another source of incredible disparity, right? In terms of renters versus owners. So these are the home values in Snohomish County is your yellow guy, and then your surrounding counties. Though I gave you Pierce too as kind of, your competitor, I suppose, for some of the jobs or the economic development that radiates out from King County. So I do have Pierce in there as well. Now you can see King County, that home value growth starting to slow down, and you'll see that expected in this graph. Here's, ready for this? I'm going to show you the year-over-year changes so you can see the whoops. Did I not? Maybe it pops there. There we go. So here are the year-over-year growth going back. This is not as far back as Zillow does provide their public metrics. They can go back all the way to 2000 or 1996 in many cases, but I did want to show the variability in all these places, so I scrunched it in. But that in 2014, that's as high as it went in Snohomish County, right? That was underwater. Homeowners couldn't, put their home on the market for sale. So industry was incredibly tight at a time when home values had crashed, and so buying homes was incredibly appealing. As time went on, interest rates lowered, and that helped buyers return to the housing market. But check out what we've got going on right here, right? We saw things start to moderate and slow down, and economists were explaining that to me, and well, home values had already grown beyond pre-recession peaks. So the affordability of mortgages may still be low because of interest rates, but that down payment is incredibly infeasible. And yet, here we are in this moment. Home values did not fall at the beginning of the crisis. If anything, they started skyrocketing up. And a lot of this has to do, well, there are different things, right? I'm going to pop here. A lot of economists would have thought, this was just in many ways harvesting a lot of that demand forward at a time when inventory was very low because sellers are so uncertain. I mean, it's a crazy pandemic, so they pull back, they don't put their market on for sale. At the same time that these guys in orange, these first-time home buyers, the millennials that were looking to become home owners. And remember, even before this crisis, people who managed home ownership, who accessed, who could save for that down payment, who had high credit to access mortgages, did tend to be higher income. They did to be in more knowledge intensive fields. And so in this crisis, the would-be home buyers were more likely to maintain employment, maintain their income. They save now. They've got asset value from stocks that enables down payments, and they return to the housing market at a time when inventory is very, very low. And so in some ways, looking at that incredible heat is really just the dynamics, the demographics continuing to move forward, right? And this K-shaped recovery is actually helping boom that housing market in many ways. But people are also thinking that when I look at this kind of interest in home buying, that it's also due to the pandemic itself, right? I'm more interested in leaving the very urban downtown spaces. I'm more interested in having space and an extra office, and I'm recalibrating in many ways, not just those first-time home buyers, but existing homeowners, recalibrating, what I own and where I want to be living to adjust to a world where maybe I'm going to work from home for 2 days out of the week in the future, right? So you can see on the left, home values are growing. They're not dropping anywhere in any of these zip codes. But you see that kind of gold color, that is at least under, gosh, I'm trying to remember where I put that divider, where that middle line was. I think it might be 10%, but you can see where the 10% appreciation is in orange, and anything above that is in dark purple. Check out, South Pierce County, you see the darker purple, so even faster home value growth. And then in Snohomish, those further out places are experiencing more home value growth. Now, if I look at rents on the other side, man, that's not so surprising, right? Like one, all that gray is just because Zillow doesn't report home value indices for rent metrics where they don't have good samples, right? So they don't have great time series behavior in less dense, where they don't have a lot of rental listings to train their models. So you do see only some of those zip codes filled in, but I think you can still see this radiating pattern, right? The downtowns are absolutely suffering, whereas kind of further out, that's where people are moving their rental interests as well. So, okay, I've got all sorts of people changing how they live and moving around. I've got inequality that's due to this, rising inequality that's due to this crisis. We go into crisis management mode. The Fed lowers the interest rates again. Home values, mortgage rates and other financing, rates for financing in general are as low as they've ever been in so many ways. Like, look at that purple line. We talked when we were managing the global financial crisis, just how low those interest rates were. They're insane right now. If you maintained your employment, that's critical. You can still be a homeowner and not be able to access, that interest rate unless you maintained employment. But if you maintained employment, you have access to an incredible source of cheap equity, really, and that can help build up your resiliency. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. Okay, so. Oh, and then those interest rates, when we think about that divide and inequality, the mortgage rates don't just support, or low interest rates don't just support then mortgage rates and then home buying activity. They also support inflation of all kinds of assets, right? So the S&P 500 that you see in front of you here is just experiencing incredible growth out of this. And again, that contributes to that divide, because it's not just the ability to save, but it's the savings you already had that's now building in value over time. So I see all these things and I see this massive shock. So I can look at these long histories and see such gradual change over longer periods of time. And when I see this discontinuity, my golly, I can see that something incredible has happened. I'm going to try and make this transition as abrupt as possible. But if I look at global mean temperatures, I see the same thing. Okay, the scale on this graph is 12,000 years. So we're going back into we're coming out of the ice age here. So these are the changes in temperatures from a long run average over what's called the Holocene period. So this is the period of time which humans have lived on Earth, right? Now, when we think about climate change and when we think about, let's just go straight at it, whether or not it's real or happening or human driven, right? I think about this graph a lot, and that same intuition from seeing gradual changes over long periods of time. Some of them were incredible events, sure, but the one for the pandemic is stark and incredible. If you look at these changes in global temperatures over time, look at the very end of that graph, okay? Those black lines, those are observed Those are observed measures of temperature. Everything back into the past is estimated from, ice cores and all sorts of other scientific approaches. And you can tell there's a lot of uncertainty. Scientists are often uncertain about, you use different models and you get different results, but they're presenting their uncertainty with these gray bars, right? I think in some ways, scientists' willingness to really talk about uncertainty and not have alarmism, or sensationalism driving the way that they talk about these things, maybe has led us to be a bit slow on recognizing the problem here. But if I zoom into the end of that, you can really see how stark this is. And when we talk about how the pandemic has introduced an economic shock, a huge economic shock to our economic system, climate change is a massive shock to our Earth system. And we are already experiencing the aftermath of that in the terms of increased volatility, heat waves, greater incidence of wildfire from drought, leading to hot temperatures, drying out all that fuel, and all it takes is an ignition, and I get a much bigger wildfire than I used to in the past because of drought, because of higher temperatures able to dry everything. I get heavier precipitation at one time, and all the floods and 1,000-year events. So this is absolutely something that's changed. And when I think about, okay, is it people? You see the same radical discontinuity in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is absolutely a challenge and one that needs to be solved. And when I start these conversations, I think I'm trying to figure out what is the way to do it so that everyone comes along with me, right? And we get to optimism and we get to the future and we get to thinking about the next stages. And I think this is one of the ways to anchor that, is to think about these discontinuities, the pandemic as a crisis and being able to see it in data and carbon and global temperatures, and to see it so starkly in data. This is absolutely our next challenge. And it was our challenge before, and it's our next challenge too. And when we think about it, okay, how am I going to address the challenge? How am I going to get salience around this issue so that even in the midst of a pandemic, as we figure out how to look forward and what our future is going to look like, hopefully it looks like, or part of the plan is how to handle climate change, not just how to turn it around, right? Not just drawdown, not just carbon neutrality, but how are we as individuals, now that we know that we are going to be experiencing, larger volatility, how are we going to be resilient in our communities? And I think that does two things. One, we can talk about how climate change is going to affect us here, and that can help us then move towards resiliency, but hopefully it also moves towards salience and us being able to do some more collective action. So what do I mean by move climate change impacts here and locally? So I work with Climate Check, and they have awesome data that captures climate risk. Here I'm talking about extreme heat days. So yes, the average temperature is increasing, but actually the really hard stuff is going to be on those volatile ends of the distribution. So in more extreme heat days. Now, the way that we've done it at Climate Check, we've defined extreme heat very locally, right? Because in a place like Phoenix, Arizona, okay, if I look back in the past, only 2% of days are above 110 degrees. Only, I mean, that seems like, oh my gosh, 2% of days in a year is like 8 days. 8 days over 110 degrees. I live in the Pacific Northwest for a reason. Our threshold is only 81 degrees. Only 2% of our days go over 81 degrees. Now that makes it challenging to grow tomatoes. I grow mine in a hoop house covered in plastic in order to get real hot because tomatoes like it. But in the future, maybe those tomatoes, I won't need that hoop house. But that'll still be a challenge. So over time, we're going to have more of these extreme heat events. Obviously, Phoenix is in a bit of a rougher boat, moving from 22 days over 110 degrees to 60 days over 110 degrees. But we, more moderate, right, won't experience so much heat stroke or mortality from extreme heat, but it'll put a lot of pressure on our energy grid, right? Because if you can imagine, we went from a climate of 20 years ago where none of us really needed air conditioning. We're going to move towards a climate where we do, for periods of the year, absolutely need air conditioning. So 35 days over our extreme heat threshold, much more mild. We have a much more manageable extreme heat risk score than say Phoenix or Texas or Florida. Florida's real rough, but it's still going to impact us, right? So when we think about how do we how do we cool our homes? Now, storm risk and sea level rise contributes to rising flood risk. You can see here a bunch of cities across Washington. And here's the share of developed land with at least some risk of flooding. Now, this is not residential land, it's all developed land, so it includes industrial and commercial properties, government properties, things like that. But when we look across it, let's find Marysville, we've got 8% of that land, Everett, 13%. So definitely not on the higher side of this picture, but still a substantial level of risk. Now, some of that flooding is not just sea level rise, right? It's more water falling at one time, short periods of time. We've already experienced this. We just had, and I think I have a slide coming next and soon that kind of gives numbers on this one, but we had our wettest start of the year, for a long time. I think the last time we saw that much water over a short period of time in January was decades and decades ago. And the amount of water that was, the point I'm making here is that that's going to become so much more normal, right? So much more normal to have a storm that long and that persistent with that much water falling from the sky. And that has a lot to do with if I have warmer atmosphere and warmer oceans, the warm air can hold more water, so it can dump more all at once. And those atmospheric rivers come through. Let me look at my time because I can move quickly. Okay. So now we have storm risk rating. So the number, similar idea, right? Back in the day, I set what was an extreme precipitation event that was, only 2% of days would experience that much rain. Now, over the future, we can see the biggest rise is actually going to be over the first 10 years, as opposed to the previous graphs where we talked about heat, where it was a bit more gradual and then sped up towards 2040 and 2050. Here we have the bigger increases in volatility, bigger increases in the number of extreme storms happening within the next decade. So going from 9 to 22. And then the amount of water that falls during an extreme precipitation event is also going to increase. And here you have the counties in the US with their storm risk rating, which handles the idea of how much more water will fall over a period of time relative to what did in the past. So again, we're making these scores to reflect the stress on our local infrastructure. And when we think about our local infrastructure, what are we thinking about here in some areas in the Pacific Northwest? This is my personal play. I did something very millennial, which was, I go and I buy a home on Bainbridge Island. It turns out, did I include the slide? Yeah, it turns out I have, an eccentric suburban farmer inside of me. I want to grow these. This is my hoop house with my tomatoes in it. So that's really great. It made me very resilient during COVID, but I moved out to Bainbridge Island as a, young adult, not really knowing about septic tanks. Well, you know what happens when you have an atmospheric river that drops a record amount of water onto your property and you have a septic tank? Yeah, poops. Yeah, poop smell. Absolutely. Backs up into your home and not into your home. Well, the really bad ones back up into your home, but they back up kind of up onto the surface during your drain field, and then you literally smell poop around your property. Now, I was even living in a new construction home, and that's actually relevant to talk about, because when we talk about added resiliency, in many ways, it's making sure you have healthy soil and vegetation around your property, because that can hold so much of this extra water. And new construction tends to, when they redevelop the land, they carve out the soil, they take it, they're putting it into a big truck anyway. They often will sell that topsoil, refill or backfill with fill dirt because it's much cheaper, and then put sod right on top. Now that sod doesn't have soil to live on. Water falls onto that sod that's on top of impacted dirt and runs right off. So what happened around my new construction home on Bainbridge Island? Each time it had a heavy rain, you bet, flooding around our house, even though it was just designed, it was a new development. They went through the codes that they had to go through, or the planning that they had to go through to get approved to say this is appropriate drainage. But a lot of those standards were, again, developed for the climate that was 20 years ago, not the climate we're going to have over the next 20 years. And they're radically different. It's already measurable how radically different those climates are. Okay, then of course there's wildfire risk rating. Ours is not so bad actually, even though it absolutely exists. And in Snohomish, when you go out east, that's where you'll really kind of see a bit more. If you can see here, I have different ways of thinking about wildfire risk. The one to the far right that's more blurrier, that incorporates the idea, that's the probability of burning. It's called the aerial extent. So it's more like how frequent are your burns, right? And then the one in the middle is the flame length exceedance probability. So how severe are your burns? So how likely to affect building damage, in other words. And I have these two concepts, right? Because I can get to a chronic problem that's more mild, that's still pretty bad, as something that's very unlikely, but catastrophic when it does come. We combine those together to try and get, to consumers to talk about these countervailing risks. So let me pop back out. We're okay on a relative scale when it comes to wildfire risk ratings. And actually, I think I took out the one for Southern. Yeah, shoot. I took out the one that has the southern states for California, because you can see there are very populous areas that have dark red here, high wildfire risk. And when you think about the mechanisms, when do we start to incorporate these kind of risks in our decisions? It usually an incentive has to be at work, right? And the mechanism that we'll see earliest is going to come through in insurance. And right now, wildfire premiums are spiking in California, right? After their devastating impacts, we could see something similar, right? This kind of knowledge and understanding about what's coming could help us think about some of the challenges ahead or some of the incentives. Now, when I talk about incentives, without those incentives in place, we continue to make decisions that are less optimal, right? Just because we're not fully understanding the way that the world is changing. The CFTC came out and said, hey, we are underpricing climate risk into so many things, but they were talking about kind of financial and systemic risk, which is very scary, guys, by the way. But it's also to the idea that when we make these decisions about where to build, or hey, if we make these decisions about what to do when I have a really old septic tank and I'm going to rehab it, right? What should I put in its place? If I have an older property and, I need new windows, right? What's going to push me to pursue windows that are even better for insulation, extreme heat, extreme cold, and these swings in temperature that we would expect, right? So it's about having the information to be able to make the better decision when it comes. And that's actually pretty important. A paper that was just released from Berkeley National Laboratory, actually. So the Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, so Berkeley Labs. The paper just came out. I find it really hopeful in that there's definitely a lot that needs to be done. But the argument that they're making in this paper is that, look, as long as we just make every new decision in many ways, like new building codes, that new buildings are up to higher or different standards, or our own, renovations that we do to our existing properties. So look at number 5, right? Increase sales share of building heat pumps to 50%, right? So if we're going to replace certain systems on our older properties, the US has lots of old infrastructure, man. When we replace it, as long as we do the thing that helps, the lower carbon use, and we do the thing that makes us more resilient, both in how we experience the changes and also to avoid the changes by lowering that carbon and doing that drawdown work. It's feasible. It is physically feasible. Now, physically feasible is different than it's actually going to happen, okay? And that's why I do things like this, like talk to you guys and maybe scare you a little bit, but hopefully give you the promise that this is feasible. We just need to be making decisions with the future climate in mind, not our old kind of past experience, because it's changing rapidly and it has a lot of momentum. So we are going to experience more volatility. We are going to see the impacts of climate change more and more every year. And so when we think about that feasibility, we also need to, so here another one that I like, I can, when I share the slides, it has some of the links to these things, but if you want to get other solution oriented, so it feels hopeful, drawdown.org is also a great resource for looking at these solutions. And in many ways, if you think about the joblessness, there's this, Chris Medford, I'm so nervous to use this phrase, but economists say we use a phrase, creative destruction. And in many ways, what that means is that when an industry changes or fails, right? If I have a lot of unemployment because an industry is lagging, right? I now have a workforce, so a labor force that can be reshaped towards a new purpose. And this is a lot of, I think, what the Biden administration kind of emphasizes and thinks about, but this is the moment. You know, this is the moment to ensure that economic development and climate and our approach to climate change are a little bit more married and a little bit more aligned. Now, for all of that to happen, for us to be making decisions as we go along with climate in mind, to build resiliency, to avoid the worst of what climate change will bring by beginning carbon neutrality now. And we're not just beginning it now, it's already happening. Our actually, before I go on, I'll just mention, you know, the utilities across the Pacific Northwest have actually banded together into a coalition so that as they decommission carbon heavy power plants, for example, they have sources of energy to draw from. So we won't go into, you know, rolling grid blackout type situations, especially if you think about that while that transition is happening for our energy grid, we'll be experiencing the extreme heat days, right? So that's added resiliency and that will help. And they're already making those moves to get us more carbon neutral. So it's not like nothing is going on. There's so many wonderful things that are actively happening, but there's so much more that needs to. Now, the problem is, this is a good number, actually, I think. 72% of people think global warming is happening. That's great. That's pretty high. And if you actually look at our space in the Pacific Northwest, so King County is bigger than Snohomish, clearly. Skagit even kind of bigger than that in terms of the share of people that have greater salience about global warming. So there's very few dots here that are in the blue, which is lower than 50%. But watch what happens if I dig a little deeper. So 61% of people think global warming is already harming people in the US. So that drops down a little bit. Even though we have science and, gosh, the news have kind of emphasized the ways that we are already experiencing climate change impacts. Now, if I go down even deeper, the number gets even lower still. 43% of people think global warming will harm them personally. Now, perhaps you might not view it as harm, that things will get, you know, warmer in the Pacific Northwest or more extreme heat days. You know, plenty of people move to Phoenix still. And we already saw earlier, right? Their threshold is 110 degrees. It's such a different place. But the idea is that strain on local infrastructure is the real touch point, right? It's the real hard experience. And if we think about, you know, the experiences in Texas, if we think about the experiences in floods in Florida and Miami, I mean, there are a lot of challenges to get over here. So even a place that is used to receiving a lot of water like we have, the amount of water that we're actually going to expect is going to be so much greater at one time. Okay. Now, here's the point that, you know, these devastating events are absolutely already here. Spiking insurance premiums. Now, the looming lending restriction, that's even closer to being here than maybe the first time we made this slide. I want to say the CFTP2, but I mean, gosh, I forget the big, large national organization, but it was also supported by the Fed. Fed also came out with a piece that said, hey, we got to start regulating utilities, mortgage markets, mortgage-backed securities, all these things in their, you know, in their risk rating to incorporate the idea of climate change, because it's such a big deal. It is so widespread how it will impact our property values, certainly in so different pockets. We're going to be a big receiver, by the way, of people, I think, in the Pacific Northwest. I'm pretty, you know, for a lot of reasons of, you know, bullish about Pacific Northwest for crisis and economy reasons, but, you know, even in climate change, we're more temperate. We've got a big advantage there. So we're going to be a receiver of, I think, a lot of people as time goes by. But we are absolutely already seeing kind of those big guys have access to the data and incorporate it into pricing, and the little guys need access to. I'm with climatecheck.com. So if you go to climatecheck.com, type in your address, type in any address, type in where you want to retire one day, type in, type in your parents' homes, type in, anywhere, right? Your second property. Let's say you've got access to an incredible amount of asset value, and you want to diversify. Make sure you're looking to see what that second home see its challenges, not just its risks today, but its risks tomorrow in a climate that's changing pretty rapidly. So we're trying to bring this information to everyday consumers to do what I was talking about earlier, right? That thing where every new decision that needs to be made with a future climate in mind, especially if it's, you know, an infrastructure decision. And so we're trying to provide this kind of information. All the data that you saw above from, you know, about the climate is from Climate Check, and, you know, all the data that we're pulling in and trying to create a consumer facing model where you go on and you'll see scores like this, and then friendly, you know, everyday person language that describes what the experience of climate change will feel like where you are. So hopefully that increases both the saliency, the motivation towards action, and people, their own selves adding that resiliency to their properties as they have need of making changes. Methodology and data. I think that's, you know, and then maybe one last thing to just mention our team, you know, who we've got on here working towards things forward, you know, climatologists, hydrologists, wildfire guys, and then people I work very closely with, Dr. Annie Preston and Maximilian Stiefel, a geographer, and a computer scientist PhD with a specialization in visualizing risk. So building forward this to try and drive change. Thank you so much for having me. And remember, like, I know it's kind of crazy for me to be sitting here in the middle of a crisis and say like, hey, you know, this crazy mental health burden that we're in and the joblessness and the inequality, here's another crisis to think about. And that seems unfair. But we're in a wild moment where we have an opportunity to redirect our resources and our attention and rebuild better, rebuild greener, rebuild leaner, rebuild stronger and more equitably. I think now is the right time to talk about this kind of issue. And I look forward to the years to come.
Thank you so much, Skylar. That was an amazing presentation. I really appreciate the information you provided to us. It's a great opportunity for people to explore climate change information and how it impacts our region and area and our economy as well. So really appreciate that. So really quickly, due to time constraints, I want to make sure that we can get through some of this interesting information. So now the moment we all have been waiting for, one lucky attendee will win a pair of Alaska Airlines tickets. Alaska Airlines has been ranked the most fuel-efficient U.S. airline 7 years in a row and is the highest rated U.S. airline on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. Now, drum roll, please. The winner is Carl Moses, Hill International. So, Carl, I hope you're still on with us. You are the winner of the pair of Alaska Airline tickets. So congratulations. And I want to highlight and make sure that everyone knows that we could not have done this event without our significant sponsors. We appreciate all of you for joining us. And again, I'm fortunate to be joining this vibrant community. Thank you to our sponsors for making this event possible. Our presenting sponsor, Banner Bank. Our partner sponsor, the Boeing Company. Our signature sponsors, Alaska Airlines, Classic Country, KXA, the Everett Clinic, KRKO, Greatest Hits, Kaiser Permanente, Linwood Convention Center, Snohomish County PUD, and our event sponsors. I would like to thank you all and ask you that you consider our coffee chats that take place every Tuesday at 8:30 a.m. And then please, please, please consider joining us for the Snohomish STEM Summit, Inspiring Innovation on March 2nd at noon. You can register at economicalliancesc.org. Again, thank you all for joining today and have a great afternoon.